otra emisión de Pensadores Contemporáneos. En esta ocasión recibimos al cineasta palestino Elia Suleiman, quien ha sido invitado al Festival Universitario de Cine, el FICUNAM, y con quien vamos a tener una conversación en torno a su filmografía, en torno a su vida y a todas las perspectivas que nos pueda aportar a nosotros sobre su trabajo. Salam, Elia.
Hi.
How are you?
Good.
Are you already familiar with Mexico? You're feeling okay here?
I'm feeling very okay. I'm not terribly familiar.
No?
No, I wouldn't say that.
We have a wall too, we have some similarities.
We're digging into politics already.
No, just thinking if in your imagination. Okay, let's start it this way.
Oh.
Let's say I saw that in last film, you at least know one of our actors, which is Yael Garcia. You make a little hint, a little hello to Mexico in that film. How come?
I think you can say because it starts from the fact that this film is not about Palestine, that it is basically about the globalization of Palestine.
Okay.
So for me, it was important to actually head somewhere else also where things are similar in terms of social political situations. So Yael is a friend, and it was kind of evident that this would be the choice.
Actually, in that scene, you talk about making a film about peace in the Middle East. Is it just a joke, or is it possible? Or is it your purpose?
To make peace in the Middle East?
To make a film about peace.
No, it's not a joke, but it's a pretext, because evidently the chances of peace are not exactly there. So the fact that there is a comedy of errors, we're talking about a guy who's going to make a film that cannot be made. So this is basically why, he's making a film about peace in the Middle East, simply because it's not possible.
It's not possible. But imagination can take you, and fiction can take you very far. I've seen, for example, in your film, this beautiful scene where you take this stick for jumping.
In the time that remains.
Yeah, in the time that remains, and you jump over the wall. Like you could imagine, you can, by filming, imagine this.
Of course. You can say that this is what cinema can do, which is to always propose the potentiality for something better to come. So I think art in general is all about the imagination of better living or creating circumstances where the idea of making things better is there. So, of course, when it comes to the imagination, it's the one place where there's freedom. And you use that space of imagination for proposing all kinds of propositions of freedom. So evidently, nobody can jump over such a high wall. But the idea is to give the indication that all walls are actually not permanent, and that they can be actually crushed and they can be turned down. The problem today is that more and more walls are being built. So I think the responsibility of the artists and the filmmakers in general is how to provide more imaginations of how to put them down again. So we're not living in a situation where we have a lot of space for optimism. So we have to actually ignite hope in every possible way to somehow imagine a world where there are no walls, or where there is no, you just mentioned the word beforehand, where fascism is not ruling the show.
Yeah, I think we're up to this.
I think that my last films actually is trying to actually give a little optimistic vision of the world we live in, because we're not exactly in a situation where things are even close to okay.
I didn't feel it that optimistic. You're talking about it must be heaven, right?
Yes, I said optimist, which is pessimistic optimistic. The pessimism comes from the state of things, and the optimism comes from the imagination that something can always be done about it. But I think it's evident that when I made the last film, I was in a state of consciousness of how little hope remains in our, space. But then one can say that the act of making a film in itself is an act of hope. Now, whether that hope is an illusionary matter is what I still don't know, because I don't know why humans keep thinking also that things can be better, when if we look historically, things have only gone worse. But somehow we seem to think always that there is no maybe other choice than to imagine that something can be done about it. And that's not only on the level of art, but also, well, you can say on the art of resistance. People are still going out in the streets and they're still demanding for better living, and they're still demanding for justice, and in which case, we think that something can be done about it. Now, I'm the least optimistic of all of these people, and I think it shows from my film that, because it's, as I always said, it's maybe this is considering how I evaluate my progress in my films. I would say that this is possibly the funniest film that I've made, and when I say the most humorous film that I made, it's simply because it's the most despaired.
I know, I thought a bit the same. I thought it was much more funny, but in a way, because you turned back your back to where your parents lived, which was the actual subject of your other films. This place where you come from, in a way you kind of cut roots.
Mm-hmm.
So it's sad and it's less sentimental, so you can be more funny.
Yes, and because things are so...
You take more distance.
Yes, I would say you are right. I would say it was coming also, because on a personal level, my first, my second, my third, there was always my parents or a story that has something to do with my family and which has to do with my connectedness to the place where I was born. I think once I lost my parents, there was little connectedness to the place, let's say less. But the story does not end there. When I made It Must Be Heaven, I had this absolute feeling that I've lost connection. But this turned out to be not entirely true. Another kind of connectedness has established itself, which was for me actually in itself a surprise, because during the shooting of the film, during the preparation and the shooting of the film, I started to have a very unpredictable sense or an emotion that I have not really anticipated I would have. So as you said, I felt more distance coming to shoot, and then suddenly I started to feel that I'm reconnecting emotionally. And it felt quite strange because I didn't know exactly where it came from. But slowly I gradually started to discover that the emotional tie to the place has somehow reinvented itself in another mode and another kind of way of feeling the place which we call home, let's say. And it was no longer as the connection between myself and family, or between myself and, let's say, the national aspect, or the fact that I'm Palestinian in Palestine, or the fact that I'm in an occupation that I completely familiarized with and I identify with. It took on something different, which was really a discovery that the people the young generation, to be very precise, who are growing up in this place, have somehow reinvented their identity. And they reinvented their identity in such an organic fashion, which is something I've been yearning to do for such a long time, because I have lived so long outside of Palestine, always thinking that I could somehow achieve a certain concept, which is becoming a citizen of the world. I simply feel now that I have more or less failed, and I still yearn for a certain centeredness of some sort. When I confronted the young generation of Palestine, I felt that because they are living another kind of reality, and they have started to actually accomplish exactly what I wanted to accomplish for so long. Their sense of identity has become much more universal. They have, let's say, less to do with nationalism, in fact, than we used to have. And they have established their Palestinianism in a way that connects to the universal concept of being progressive, or of being gender conscious, of being race conscious, and of being resistant, but not necessarily in terms of the political specificity, but rather in a worldly manner. And it's something that I admired when I confronted, which is what the last scene of the film actually tried to portray. These other people.
Yeah.
Because they are really celebrating their identity in a cultural fashion, and they have absolutely no connection with any political ideology. So somehow this is what I felt was really, talk about hope, this is where I somehow felt more hopeful than with what I have been already going through for so long.
Yeah, it does convey hope. I guess it's the only way that fascism doesn't produce more fascism. If you escape the nationalism, the identitarism, all these terrible things, because it tends to create an action, or like a repression tends to create another strength back. Elia, you've been, we're in a show, in a series called Contemporary Thinkers. Mm-hmm. Do you consider yourself as a thinker? The way you, I mean, of course, by your work.
If we say by my work, then the answer is I'm suspicious of you saying yes. Reason is, when I work, I do not rely on intellect. Okay. And I completely leave that component behind. And I follow a certain intuition. And it's through the emotion that I basically take my voyage in searching for the images. So it has no intellectual component involved. It all starts from an image. All my work actually starts from an image and a certain air, a certain ambience. And so it is not based on a theory, it is not based on a concept, it is really based on some sensation of some sort that I have. Having said that, of course I have the intellectual baggage, but I do not feel that I can trust it cinematically. I can only throw myself in the risk of the images that I compose without necessarily analyzing them, without necessarily comprehending them, but simply throwing myself in this cosmos where I let loose these components to somehow relate to themselves. So the images can start to somehow have a certain potential harmony, and in this case they start to produce their own narrative and their own subliminal montage, and so they float in a kind of poetic cosmos. And to have the ambition and the desire to have a poetic image, you would have to leave your intellect behind. So I don't think I can qualify as a thinker cinematically.
So we can end the show now. No. Don't be, it wouldn't be that easy. Going on the side of the film itself and the people that watch it, would you think that cinema, or you as a spectator too, I mean, you participate in all this movie world, film world, do you think the best virtue of cinema would be to convey emotion, or is it to make people think? I mean, I think your films make think, like they move to think. So that's why the question
I'll
comes
have to think.
emotion.
But it is a very good question. You see, I will try to be precise in this one, because it's a very dangerous road to answer this question, simply because I'm always afraid to fall in the pit of rhetoric.
Okay.
I think that it is not a strategy of mine to make people think.
Okay.
And I actually do not desire this road, but I desire it if it becomes an outcome partially. But I always say that when people watch my film and it brings in an emotion, and they feel a certain tenderness, they feel a certain harmony with themselves, if they somehow, by consequence, start to dream their own images after the film, and if they start to have, for example, certain desires, which can be open to all desires, it could be that this could be a positive impact for the film. Now, this does not disqualify or exclude the thinking part. In other words, if thinking is to also ignite a certain desire, is, for example, you feel after you watched a certain film that you want to do something about your own life, that you want to make better something of your own personal life, or that it inspires you to poeticize on your own personal way, then this is the gratification that I would have. But it's not at all to open a kind of a think tank situation, because I think there's something more interesting for me when there is more spiritual,
more than
things.
Emotional, more spiritual.
Spiritual, emotional, but not necessarily intellectual.
Okay.
I think if the intellect starts to take a center stage, we might not engage in the let's say, humanist approach to things, and to somehow think about our human statue, because I think mostly what we seem to be doing many times when we make a film is also question the current human statue, which I think is on the low level at this moment.
Yeah.
And when we question and reevaluate, we might think that, let's say, what we upheld as human, we might as well work a little harder to make it, and upgrade it to more human. Because at this moment, if you think about what defines humanism, or what defines the human, looking around, it looks like really we might have to change that definition and that concept.
I think talking also defines human. And I mean, it comes out every time somebody talks to you in public that you don't talk in your films. Mm-hmm. But I would like to ask you if you enjoy talking in real life.
Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yes, but
because I was wondering how. I mean, you've been in a very long tour now with this new film. Mm-hmm. It's been going on, and I was wondering, how do you still stand up to go to the interviews and answer questions about your film when your film is already there? Like, how do you convince yourself that this has to be done? First of all, the question of it has to be done is questionable. Okay, so.
But one thing I learned about speaking is that you do not speak the film. As you just said, the film has a lot of silence, and I think it was important for me that there's a lot of a lot of non-verbal languages that are included in the film, including verbal language, but not as center stage. And I think there's something that I find quite much more open and freeing when we use less verbal language. But don't make the mistake that verbal language is a negative thing. It's just I have a feeling that if it's on the same plateau as other languages, there can be this kind of exchange between the language of silence or the language of music, or the verbal language, or the, most importantly, I can say the cinematographic language, the language of the image itself. And there is something so much open when you are watching an image, if that image is allowing the spectator to actually free float. That means without linearity and without any kind of centeredness to it. So if it's open to, let's say, the limitless possibilities of interpretation, which leaves a kind of democracy to the spectator to interpret, the very personal, intimate spectator. That means when you are a person watching a film, you are actually participating in the making of the film yourself. Then that is what I aspire to. Having said that, when you speak about the film, well, there is something paradoxical, because if you start to just make rhetoric language, then you are taking away from the magic of what the film is trying to do. What I try to do is simply see what I personally learned about making this in this film. So it is not speaking about the film, it becomes also a self-search about why I made this film. So I speak somehow in the proximity and not necessarily about, but nearby. So I don't want to ruin, the magic that the film is giving, not only to the spectator, but to myself as well, because I am a spectator myself. So talking to me is maybe talking to the closest spectator to the film, possibly, the most familiar spectator, but not necessarily the maker.
Of course. Yeah, it's also like having having conversation. You throw the first stone of the conversation by the same. You're the first that throws something in, and so we start talking, right?
Of course, and I think that that some of this comes from a certain, for example, to question why I make the film. I personally do not have the direct, clear, coherent answer, exactly. I throw certain, assumptions also. For example, maybe, possibly, potentially, I made this film because I felt a certain necessity to speak about something that I start to feel that we need to talk about. Maybe I start to feel that it is important that some of the unspoken things get to be spoken about. For example, there's certain anxieties that we are living that we almost never really touch, personally. I'm not saying about what we see in the media and what is talked about in theories or philosophers, or no, I'm talking about our waking up in the morning and how we sense our own personal alienation from what is happening, around us. Take today's world, which is, with the coronavirus, and there's so many feelings that we have that we're not exactly, because it's so intimate that your alienation needs to somehow be expressed in a very personal way. But similarly, I could say when I made the film, I felt that even for the sake of consoling each other about our own lonesome, alienated position, because we wake up and we're asking, what is going on around us? And there's so much going on that is not exactly to our comfort. It feels just so estranging, I think this is maybe part of the reason why or what drove myself to actually want to, talk about, the big issues, which is, what's happening to us in the world today.
Of course. Well, what is sad is that when we wake up and we feel this, we have to forget it if we want to get along with our life and we want to do what we have to do. Because mostly when we're alone and we don't know other people think the same, and maybe we're a lot of people not happy and that we cannot go along living this life like this.
Exactly.
Right? But when you're alone and you don't know this, you're like, I'm the only one that feels broken. I have to just forget about this and go forward.
But when you know that so many of you are exactly in the same position, but you're not talking about it.
Yeah.
And this is, I think, what has been happening for the last decade, I would say, is people are not, looking in the eyes of other people and saying, we are living this. We are unable to propose propositions of how to actually be less lonely and less alienated. And we're letting all of this come to us. We're aware today of, let's say, we're so aware of what the politicians are doing. Yeah. We cannot even deny it 1 second, as we might have denied it a while ago. We know these people are actually coming to destroy our lives. Right. But at the same time, we want to maintain, in a kind of denial way, a sense of continuity to take the little pleasures of the everyday. And we are unable to come together also to say, okay, but in order to maintain this intimacy and this pleasure of the everyday, well, we have to do something about these politicians. But these politicians are so powerful, and they have tanks, and they have armies, and they have police. And how are we going to do that if we're going to maintain the continuity? So there is a situation where it is really hard to go forward. And in a way, what is so paradoxical is like we want to do it also in a pleasurable way and not in an ideological fashion. We want to take pleasure from resistance and not necessarily just get the beating of the sticks of the police.
And we don't want to take the arms for like.
Of course not.
Maybe we've had enough of wars, right?
Because this is the thing about, this is where I come back and say this young generation that exists now, everywhere I go. I mean, you have them here for sure.
Yes.
And they are also, in a creative sense, trying to reinvent the momentum and the means of resistance in a way that is giving pleasure. It is a cultural kind of resistance. They are managing something that maybe, my generation and the generation before have not really, invented it in the same pleasurable fashion. So I'm envious actually of the times, that the new generations are living, regardless of the fact that they are also living a much harder time, and what they are facing is much fiercer.
Yeah. Talk a little bit more about how you started all this. You were talking about your baggage.
Mm-hmm.
You have said, or I have read, or we almost or less know, that you are self-taught, mm-hmm. that you are an autodidact, mm-hmm. right? How do you start doing this? How do you, having not studies, filming studies, how did you manage to do this film, this first film?
Oh, it's a lot of endless hours of loneliness. It's so difficult, when we are in a university. So I can even say, when I give master classes to university students who are studying film, and they say, but why are you telling us what you're telling us when you didn't study? So how come we are here in this university? Okay, I have an answer to that, which is don't go my way. Because it's really, first of all, there is no one way. Some filmmakers I know, either they never went to school or they dropped out of school because they couldn't stand the framework. But there are quite a lot of very good filmmakers who actually went to school, and they went out of the school and made very good films. So I don't think there's one way to do it. I just don't like if you've asked me if I want to repeat the same experience I have in terms of achieving, or doing what I did, I'm not so sure I can say that I would, because first of all, it's very tough. During my time also, it was not as it is today, where the means of making films are much more available. You could take a digital camera and express yourself, and it was much more expensive to do that. The mistrust that you receive from knocking on doors to get any form of funding or support, the mistrust is way beyond any imagination. I mean, the mocking even of people, of you, when you say, but I have a feeling I might be saying something cinematically that you might want to see. What you receive is mostly negative answers. I remember when I was living in New York and I was starting to ask for funds from grants and all of that. The mailbox, which was like 5 meters outside of my door, every day was like, okay, what kind of apologetic letter I'm going to be receiving today? It's just not a very sweet way to go, I would say. I don't know what it is that made such a fragile, cowardly, not necessarily self-secured or self-confident person like myself continue to knock on doors, continue to insist that there is something that I want to say that must be said. I have no idea.
I see you like this image of the, how do you call this jump over the wall in English?
I don't know.
Salto de garrocha in Spanish. You have this image that you would do it.
I only have a memory of myself, like every time I got a bang and I kind of fell and I went through a depression, and that somehow I would pull myself back again in a kind of Terminator kind of fashion and continue to advance.
Well, it took you 5 films to get to it, to represent it.
Believe me that even until today, I am not so sure I know the way, and I am not so sure I have come to any kind of comfortable seat. I still face a lot of resistance to different kinds of resistance. In the beginning, I remember that being Palestinian and wanting to talk something Palestinian was almost impossible, because during the years of my first film, for example, the general tendency of the liberal world was that we speak for you, better than you would speak for yourself. So there was this kind of post-colonial discourse going on. I am not so sure that this post-colonial discourse has evaporated. I think it just took different forms, became more intelligent, and more sneaky in a way of how to come back at you in different means. Not that it has not itself become fragile, because I feel that post-coloniality has itself become a little more fragile, because I think something has been achieved by the anti-colonial forces. Something has been achieved, and it has been pushed back slightly, and the awareness of people who resisted colonialism has come to also certain strategies and means to actually stop post-coloniality from advancing. But it has not finished. The work is not finished. I mean, I can tell you that until today, I come to become sometimes a bit sarcastic when there is the presumption that we have achieved something. For example, take the hashtag momentum that is happening now with the gender issue.
The Me Too.
And sometimes I'm really sarcastic, because if you really want to achieve gender equality, there's so much more to it than just to do this kind of signature thing. And I'm not belittling this achievement, but I'm saying it is far from what needs to be done, because I am absolutely certain that gender and race and anti-post-coloniality and justice and mainly economic uh, justice is what needs to be achieved so that actually gender issues can be achieved. But to just say, oh, women's rights, while the system is still running on corruption and
They all go together. Racism and gender and...
So the puzzle has to be, of every single issue of this, because if we think we can achieve anything about race or gender issues while neoliberal economy is still kind of, flourishing, we are completely in an illusion.
I agree. I'm going to sound maybe a bit cruel, but I wish you don't find your comfortable place. I think this uncomfortable place does a lot for your filming too.
Well,
or you feel tired?
No, it's not. No, it's not fatigue. Sometimes you would think that if only it was not the problems surrounding us that makes us think of poetic languages.
Yeah.
That you would want to actually, and maybe that's possible. In other words, sometimes I feel that, okay, I chose this way, I've lived in many cities, but I long for things I did not, for example, live. And maybe there's something to be told about that, i.e., for example, what if I have another chance and I'm living out there with the trees and not with the humans, and maybe some poetics would come out of that as well. I think I would have a lot more ease and comfort trying to, compose and be living with nature, even if there would be some harsh moments as well there, because there's always cruelty, in nature as well. But maybe it's not as equal as to the cruelty of the humans.
Yeah, it's a very different cruelty. There's no this, I don't know, it could be a long philosophical talk about cruelty. I would like to ask you if in your childhood, I mean, there's in The Time That Remains, I think in all your trilogy, there's a lot of your childhood there. You can feel it, even in the first two films. But mostly you go really to fiction, autobiographical fiction on the third. Was it like that to be in Nazareth, or was it different? What I want to ask is, weren't you ever tempted by activism, taking the arms, being a terrorist, affiliate to a political party when you were a kid, or a young, very, very young man before leaving?
No, never.
Never. And what? Okay.
Until today, I would say I don't know even how to participate in a demonstration. We are what we become. I mean, I don't think that I can change who I am. In that I would have to analyze a bit my persona, and take a distance and say, who is this person that does want this or doesn't want that? And I've never really had a desire not even to walk in a demonstration. I don't think I have done that.
Really?
Ever. Maybe I have done it once and I don't remember.
And what about this sublimation of violence that you have in your films? For example, when your character in the film is eating this apricot and suddenly takes the seed out and makes a tank explode?
Here's a terrorist for you. A good terrorist.
Is it a sublimation of violence? A way?
I think, it's an interesting question whether the inner violence projected in this fashion is productive or not. I have no idea. I think partially I'm trying to hide my inner violence through the humor. Evidently, I will never be able to explode a tank. Evidently, I am such a cowardly person, I don't know how to even use that.
Thank God.
But whether I tend to think in the poetics of this violence that tanks should be exploded and that they should melt back into their natural origin, yes, I can say absolutely. I do think that anything that represents power and military and violence should be done with. But I'm not the strategist to know how that can happen. But I think that I think it's tragic that people take tanks and military equipment for granted as if this is like natural, but it is not. And don't forget that when you make an image like this, you don't think about, all of what I'm telling you now.
Yeah, no, you know what I felt? I felt like this pleasure.
But it happens to be just that. Actually, what happened also, as in all my films, it comes from this kind of little, how should I say, gag moment. In other words, for example, this story comes from a real story of myself driving somehow around Jerusalem. I was driving somewhere to go somewhere, and there was a truck carrying a tank heading to the north, which means this is going to probably like bomb Lebanon or something, I don't know what. And as it passed me by, I was eating a fruit. And when I finished the fruits, I actually threw the seed and I said, boom, like this, in a kind of a joking way. And when this happened, I parked the car and I wrote a scene saying, ES rides on the, which is what you ended up seeing. So yes.
It was very vivid. I have to tell you, I'm totally lost in time. I think we're getting to the end of this conversation, I think. I have like a lot of questions, so I'm going to stick to just one, maybe two. This is really more about your films. I'm going to pass over the question about policemen and soldiers are maybe stupid. Maybe they are. But I'll try to go to something, to the figure of twins. There's a lot of twins, these doubles, mirror doubles in your film. What is this obsession?
Could you give me an example?
For example, in the hospital, twins, these brothers that are alike? Like two brothers that are the same, or two people that move the same, like
Yes. It's not an obsession. It's part of my my choreographic, desires when I'm making dances, when I make the police dance in the street, or I'm definitely, again, I'm analyzing myself. I think I have a total attraction to sameness and a certain desire to create a choreographic movement from that. So it's not an obsession with twins or anything like this, but it is something to do with a certain collage of the animation that creates humor or creates the pleasure of the dance.
Now you say it's so choreographic. There's also like triads I see around.
Yeah.
Well, the policemen actually are mostly in Paris, when it's like
Yeah.
very hilarious. In your last film, It Must Be Heaven, it's triads. It's true, it's very choreographic.
But I'm very, very much always using choreography in my films. In every single film of mine, there is always choreography. And that choreography is another language that adds to the language of the image. So I'm quite attracted to it.
I really thought it was more about symbols, like twins are these other same, but not quite the same. I always think about this wall in Palestine and these neighbors. There's a lot of neighbors in your.
Well, I come from a neighborhood.
You come from a neighborhood. I think we all have neighbors. Actually, don't you suffer now in Paris with this relation with neighbors so distant and cold?
Yeah.
Do you suffer this?
Yes.
Don't you miss your neighbors even if they're like cursing each other?
I do very much. I do, because also the humor that crazy neighbors produce is really interesting. I come from a very kind of tough neighborhood. So of course it's a little ghetto, and in the ghetto there's ghetto humor, and there's all these kind of crazy characters, that come about. So even when they create havoc, they're funny in a certain way. I mean, You know, when a neighbor says what he says, and you're like, all of these stories of the neighbors actually come from real stories. It's not.
It looks so natural. I'm sure of it.
Yeah. It all comes from real characters, real neighbors. Even in certain circumstances, I try to use the same people, you know, to do the same, you know,
to
character.
do the same gag, the role they did in real life. But it really makes me go to the symbolic part of being together, being neighbors in one land, and sometimes not understanding each other, being twins, like mostly the same as I was saying, but not the same. And mostly when there are twins, like your character, which is the third one watching, is always there. So like there's this mirror thing going around all the time.
There's potential for this kind of interpretation,
Oh.
but it's not a
But
strategy.
You weren't doing it. Okay.
No. It's just a certain, just like what triggers a certain desire or a certain attraction. So, for example, why would I want to choose, like the scene in the restaurant with the girl?
Yeah, and the two guys, the girl that is eating.
With the whiskey and all of that. Why would I choose them to look like this? Definitely the fact that I wanted them somehow similar is because of the humor. Because they are all like angry looking, violent looking, and they're doing the same thing at the same time, and evidently it produces more humor for me if and certainly necessarily it takes all the realism away. Imagine now the contrary, that I did not choreograph them. I did not say put the thing at the same time, take them at the same time, and I just let them do it realistically. We wouldn't have the same scene.
Of course.
Yeah.
Well, I must say thank you.
You're welcome.
For this conversation. Very welcome to Mexico. And, well, we'll be seeing all your films in the festival.
Yes, I'm looking forward.
Something else to add?
No, I want to say that I'm loving it here. As long as there's mezcal and the great food
Mezcal.
that you guys
Well,
have.
another thing that is very present in your films is alcohol.
Yes.
We'll talk about that later with some mezcal, more mezcal.
Absolutely.
Okay?
All right.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.